is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fourth Sunday after Pentecost for the week of June 21st, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I am excited to be, again, in this season after Pentecost, where we're in a growing season, and especially with where we'll be going this week. I feel like this is a time where, in a different way compared to like Lent, but it's a reflection on how can we be growing? What ways can we be growing? What ways can we be challenging ourselves to continue to grow? And I think that's difficult because that comes from a lot of self-reflection, that comes from a lot of deep thought. It comes from the ability to be able to look at where your weaknesses are and being able to assess them correctly. And then being able to recognize how is God going to continue to help you and work you through those and continue to help you grow in those, and making sure that you're not necessarily getting caught up in the atmosphere of whatever is going on around you. Being able to stand firm with where you're at while still consistently reflecting upon that. And I think that's one of the things that's very difficult at times is growth is not always linear as we expect. It's one of these things that is constantly kind of shifting and moving a little bit through self-evaluation. And this is very much similar to like how we do the scientific method. Your understanding of something based off of how further experiments and further studies can shift and evolve based off of what we're finding with those studies. And I think that's where this season after Pentecost, and especially here in the United States, in the northern half of the northern hemisphere, it's summer. It's these times that there's things going on, there's things I should be working on, there's things that I should be doing, but yet it's these reflection times that are so vitally important for us to be able to grow in our faith. And that's one of the things that I think is so important and beautiful about this time of the church year. And this would be a perfect lead into the question for last week, which was, how are you going to diversify your microbiome? And I had some interesting responses, but I thought one response was really good, talking about how they went to their diet and talking about some dietary changes that they needed to do, but then they were looking beyond just their diet. They were looking at it from also the perspective of their life, and what are things that they have incorporated at different points of their life that have been set aside for a while, and that now is maybe the time to re-bring that in as they are going through some additional transition in their life. And I think that's a very valid point as well. When we talk about our own lives and we talk about what we're needing to for spiritual growth, for physical growth, for emotional growth, all of these different types of things, there's sometimes seasonality to them, but there's sometimes we put something down, we didn't mean to put it down for that long. That it's time to re-pick it back up again and to move into that next phase of life. And I think that's one of the things also for us to be reflecting on and thinking about as we are in this season after Pentecost. It's a lot of things to be constantly thinking about and reflecting on, but it's also very vital to where we are moving. So let's just jump into it this week. The Old Testament text then is out of Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 21. Remember, this is then coming after the promise that we have with Sarah and Abraham. And in this, Sarah basically admits to Abraham that she is jealous of Hagar. Now, Hagar is the slave of Abraham and has a child with Hagar, Ishmael. Abraham, as you can imagine, is a little bit taken back a little bit with this. God then speaks to Abraham and states that obey Sarah on this, but trust me, I will continue to take care of your descendant. So he sends Hagar and Ishmael out, and we get this really interesting point here that I think is really important for us to hear is Hagar has this skin of water. She goes out and they go through it, and she puts the child underneath a bush and is basically crying out to God, just don't let me see the child die. We are out of water. We're out of things to eat. We're going to die out here. And God comes back with, do not be afraid, and recognizes that when she turns around, that there is water there to provide. And that this is the beginning then of more the Islamic side of the faith, but the aspect of how even in these moments when we don't expect or we don't think that anything is going on, we think that it's over, that God continues to provide. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 86, verses 1 to 10 and 16 and 17. And this is one of those moments where we're crying out to God. It's this psalm of crying out, stating, I don't deserve this. I've been your servant, but I still don't deserve this. I am not worthy of all this. But yet your steadfast love continues to go out, that you continue to provide for me, you continue to care for me, you do all these things for me, and I am gracious because of that. We get right at the end of the psalm, and recognizing that God continues to provide for God's people. The other alternative text this week for the Old Testament is out of Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 7 to 13. And this is, again, one of these moments where the prophet Jeremiah has not been necessarily very popular with the people of Israel. And it's this recognition on how I am trying to cry out on what God is wanting me to do, but yet the people are not willing to hear it. They're wanting my destruction. They're wanting, bring it down. They're saying that this isn't from you, or they don't want to hear it. But the prophet Jeremiah continues to circle back around to the idea of recognizing who God is, recognizing that God will prevail, whether they want to listen or not, and that this prophet has more fear of God than what is of man at this moment. So this recognition on how the Lord is still going to spin this for the good, even though it might seem really hard at this time. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 69, verses 7 to 10, optionally 11 to 15, and then continues for 16 through 18. And this is one of those moments where we can be ashamed. We have fallen short. We're doing all these things and fasting, and we're in sackcloth, as it's stating, like we're in all these things. We're being accused of all this different things. And knowing that the Lord's steadfast love will continue to be good to us, and that the mercy from God is going to continue to be there and draw us in, redeem us, being able to guide us and bring us toward God. This recognition on how no matter how far we feel that we have abandoned God, God has not abandoned us. And this moment of how others may see us that same way, but yet God continues to still welcome us in. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Romans chapter 6, verses 1b to 11. And this is a moment here where Paul gets into kind of, as we are baptized into Christ, we are baptized into the newness of life, and that this isn't putting aside stuff of our old selves to continue to redirect us on where God is wanting us to be. Letting know that there's times that we are going to struggle, there's going to be times that we let God down, but yet we're still trying to redirect ourselves back to where God is wanting us to be. And we need to consider then that sin being dead. This is not something that we continue to relive, rehash. It's one of these moments where God is saying, you put that to the side, I have taken care of that, and you redirect, you realign yourself, and you move forward. The gospel text then this week is out of Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 to 39. This is kind of continuing with where we were last week, and this recognition on how, as the disciples go out, that there isn't necessarily always going to be this beautiful welcome to them. That there's going to be things where they're going to be fearful. There are going to be things that are going to be, people don't want to hear what you have to say. And yet, it's this recognition on you have to continue to rely on God. And that there's going to be moments, there's going to be things that God is putting out there that you don't want to say, you don't want to bring. And we hear this in particular in verse 34. I do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. And then gets into how this is going to turn households against each other. This recognition on how there are going to be things in life that appear to just cause havoc. But it's this recognition on keeping our eyes fixated on God and losing ourselves in that we will actually truly find who God has intended us to be and where we are intended to be with that. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their sermon brainwaves, podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, be able to go through different commentaries from other biblical scholars, going through these texts, along with just some great commentary of discussion on a lot of different church stuff. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with having prayers, hymns, daily readings to get you into the text. And as we've been talking about, their art section is getting a huge remodel as the Art in Christian Tradition website is being soft launched, and they're looking for feedback. If you haven't checked that out, I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's awesome to be able to see art throughout the world, throughout history, of how we are interpreting these different texts, how we are bringing different aspects out of them, how are we showing the message consistently through art. I think is also a really keen and great observation. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. I'd also recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies in the weekly lectionary, along with some additional notes and kind of green notes of things of that nature. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy looking at some of those different resources over there and seeing and coming alive with how can we work together and be able to bring more of a environmental slant into our ministry. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet by Isang Nadali Teddy. Again, everything that I have heard from people who have actually read through this article, it's been amazing for people. They've really enjoyed it. It's really going at a high level, not necessarily digging into the nitty gritty of the science, but going from still a good high level, talking about how science and faith do not compete, but instead work together. It's a great read. I would recommend it. It's the second link down in the references section, and I'd highly recommend checking that out. As human beings, there's a lot of interesting things that we will do when we are scared. There's a lot of things where when we are scared, we don't want to change. We want to stay with what we know. And if we look at what Jesus is calling for us, the cost of discipleship, the calling out for us to continue to move forward, it's not known. It's very scary. And yet God is telling us through Jesus that we shouldn't be scared, that I'm going to continue to be with you and continue to take care of you the whole way. And yet we see in these other texts that there is definitely times as the human, we feel like we have been abandoned. We feel like we've been cast out. We see it in Hagar, we see it in Jeremiah, and heck, we even see it in some cases in the Romans text where we're talking about how do not continue in the sin, but there's some times where it's like, I don't feel like God's there with me, even as all this stuff is coming at me. So how the heck can I just trust that God is going to take care of me? I think we have to then understand and look through our human history a little bit for us to be able to get a better glimpse of this. And then I think we can also look at modern day. And between those two, I think we can start to get a glimpse of different ways that maybe potentially we need to be leaning into trusting God with things instead of trusting on our own understanding. Let's rewind to 1721 in Boston, Massachusetts. In Boston, Massachusetts, at this point, we have largest smallpox outbreak that we have ever had in the pre-formed United States at this point. And how it's considered, it's one of the worst outbreaks ever. There's about a little over 10,500, 10,600 people in Boston, and there will be around over 5,700 who are infected, and recorded deaths within that year of just short of 1,000 people dying of smallpox. Smallpox being a bacteria that comes in and it causes kind of lesions on the skin and also flu-like symptoms. And in doing that, again, this is hard, it's fairly contagious, and it kind of leaves major scarring on people as well in most cases. And as this outbreak is happening in 1721, there starts to kind of be this discussion of how do we prevent this? Well, a Puritan minister of all people, Cotton Mather, talks to one of his slaves, Onesimus, and talks to him, he's an African slave, on has this ever happened in their village? And they're like, yes, it has, but we really haven't had outbreak issues with this in 500 years. He's like, what? Tell me more about this. Have you had this? And he's kind of a little bit shy, coy with it, and stating that kind of in the aspect that when I was a child, someone had the disease. And what we did is we made a slight cut in my skin and we pushed the pus out of the smallpox into the wound. I felt kind of woozy for a couple of days, but I've never had problems with smallpox. In doing this was something that Cotton Mather found very interesting and started talking with some of his other African slaves, and they were kind of coming up with the same type of thing. He ends up having a discussion with Zabdiel Boylston, who is one of the physicians in Boston at the time, and they decide they're going to try this process. And this caused huge controversy. You had people claiming that this was against God's will, even though the amount of people who are dying from smallpox is somewhere in the ballpark of 11 to 15% of people who gather this. And they basically have, even like one of our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, they end up making a newspaper. And one of the big things that was talked about in like the opinion section was how this whole process of what Mather and Boylston was doing was outrageous. It should be outlawed. It's against humankind. It's against what God's will is. And really what they were doing is they were doing early vaccines. They were a century ahead of where they were going to be. And in fact, the smallpox vaccine, how it was ended up kind of really taking form was about 70 plus years later, they found on the milkmaids had a similar type of thing. And when they looked at it, the bacteria that was causing all this disease is the same bacteria that milkmaids didn't have any problems with smallpox. They were able to use and send in some of the cells, some of the bacteria in there to boost the immune system so that people didn't have issues with smallpox. This is now common practice to the point where smallpox has basically been eradicated from the whole world. There's a couple isolated spots in labs where we keep the bacteria there, and they're very much under lock and key and very much controlled to make sure that there isn't another outbreak. But it's basically been eradicated from human history. And the beginnings of how we understand vaccines to be working, and we've talked about it a few weeks ago. Basically, what they were doing with putting that into the skin is it was helping those T cells to recognize this as an invader and priming the system so that when something did happen, the body already knew how to handle it. It was primed for it. Instead of looking at this as something against God's will, they were trying to recognize that maybe this is something that we can learn from, understand further, and actually help our bodies to be able to do God's will, helping people. The modern day, I think, thing we can talk about with this a little bit further is the fear around AI. Artificial intelligence has really ramped up, and we've talked about it in light different ways like CRISPR and different things of that in the past. But let's be honest, the world that we're walking into is going to be much different than what we recognize here today. And part of that is because of how we're utilizing AI. Now, granted, is there a lot of things that still need to be worked and tweaked and done with AI? Yes. But it's easy for us to get wrapped up in all these things that it's going to eliminate, or fears of losing jobs, or fears of different things of that nature. And I get those fears. I don't think they're not worthy of discussion. But also, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater in the same breath. If we look at AI specifically within the medical field, because we're able to specialize and train it on a very specific task, it can be extremely helpful. I'll attach a video down below. There was one of the tech YouTubers that I just found recently, her going through and being very vulnerable as she's just written a book talking about her life trying to do everything with AI. But one of the things she talked about was going in for a mammogram and talking about with her family history that she had like a 39% chance of having breast cancer, and she has very dense breast tissue, thus making it very possible for something to be overlooked. The radiologist, when looking at the scan, was utilizing AI right there on the side. And it was stating, here are 3 specific spots that you might want to look at further 2 of the spots the physician immediately was able to look at and say, nope, this isn't anything. And 1 spot, there was some further testing that they wanted done because there were some things that were a little suspicious. What's the advantage to that? The advantage to that is we're able to train a model that is very uber specific and is still able to then take all this data and help us actually make sure that people have better health in this case. One of the things that we didn't talk about with smallpox, it could easily be argued, at least here in the United States, it's the first time of like the anti-vax movement because there were so many people against it, including both Mather and Boylston getting death threats and Mather even having a bomb thrown in his house. It didn't explode with a whole note, but people were scared because it was a much different treatment and they were afraid that we were putting in that bacteria that was causing all this illness direct into the skin of healthy people and that it was just going to make them sick. And we understood why they were. But yet he was utilizing his resources and talking to people who had said this is something worth looking into, worth looking at. This is something that we've been dealing with for over 500 years. And we also have to remember within that there was a whole context of racism as well because of just where the pre-United States was at that moment. Jesus is calling us and letting us know that a lot of times our fear, our things that we're scared about, we have to remember 2 things. That 1, God will call us into uncomfortable situations, and we have to be okay with that. And 2, that God is not going to abandon us in those times. No matter how much it may feel that way, God does not abandon us. We have to be willing and able to embrace the fear. We have to be willing and able to embrace the change. We have to be willing and able to embrace something different. It doesn't mean blindly following it. And that was one of the things that did get also brought up with the smallpox outbreak is the aspect of there hasn't been a lot of studies being done on this. That's a fair argument. But there was also at a time where you were losing so many people, it was worth giving a shot. And especially with where medicine was at that point, it's not like you could just go and do it in a lab and see how things are going. It didn't have that type of technology at that point to be able to do something like that and be able to be confident in the results. Now we do have some of that stuff, but now there's other fears that we have. We need to be willing and able to recognize where our faults are. We need to be willing and able to recognize that God is going to continue being with us in those times, in those trials. God's continued to be with Hagar and Ishmael. God continued to be with the prophet Jeremiah. God continued to be with Paul talking to the Romans that don't stay in your sin. You have been made into a new person. Continue to pursue that no matter what the world is saying to you. But as a scientist, we still have to be healthy skeptics. Healthy skeptics in the aspect that we're not blindly following something, but also being willing and able to adapt and change as more and more results are there. And that includes us being open to hearing things that are a little bit different than what we normally be okay with, what our normal comfort zone is. We have to recognize that God is still in those moments of fear. God is still in those moments of places of uncomfort. I know for me, there are times where I have found where there are some uncomfortable conversations or hard things that I have to go through, but I still have to recognize and trust that God's going to be in that. And as I grow older, I learn that there's times to hold my tongue. I learn that there's times to speak my opinion. There are things that seemed easier in ways as a child because I didn't know everything. I didn't have all this insight. Things seemed more black and white. And I think we realize in life there's a lot of times there are shades of gray, but we have to be open to hearing them. We have to be open to recognizing that and then continuing to work with God to hear where is the voice of truth, teaching us and pulling us toward. And that's a constant, not a one-time conversation. It's a constant conversation. The disciples didn't just go out once. The disciples continued to go out time and time and time again. It meant that they needed to come back to God time and time and time again. And I think that's one of the things where we as humans can get caught up. We can get stuck, is we think it's a one-time communication. But no, it's something that we have to keep communicating, keep walking with, keep talking with God on. And I know for myself, that's something that I probably don't do enough good work in. I know there are times that I will put myself into some of those situations, but I also don't feel like I do the second half of that well, of continuing to bring it to God and continue to making sure that I'm allowing my vision to be toward where God is steering me. And in a culture that we are asked more and more to have quick decisions, quick demands, and whatever you said once is what you will be forever, we have to recognize that that's not what God is calling us into. Ben Franklin, even though he spent plenty of time dismissing how this early vaccination stuff worked, by the end of his life, stated the opposite and saw the benefits of what the smallpox vaccine was doing. We have to be willing to adapt and change within our own lives to have that type of revelation ourselves. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you need more reflection? Where do you need more reflection? And when I say that, I'm saying that in the aspect that we have to be open to hearing things. We have to be open to new ideas. We have to be open to new possibilities, things that are a little bit different, things that are outside the box, things that we normally wouldn't consider. Where are we going to do that for ourselves? It's necessary for us. It's necessary for our life. It's necessary for us in order to keep moving forward. And I think sometimes the oddballs, the things that seem weird, are sometimes actually the things that we need the most, and the things that's going to help us move forward the most. So I'd encourage us to do that thing, because I think as we've learned through history and as we go through things that seem really scary, it also moves us forward and can help us connect and allow us to do things that we've never imagined before. And that is something worth talking and celebrating with God as well. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.